When we think of Renaissance art, what usually comes to mind are grandiose masterpieces. Michelangelo's David, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, Botticelli's Birth of Venus. The Renaissance is often portrayed as a glittering rebirth of human creativity, a time of rediscovered classical beauty, technical brilliance, and inspired genius. It's the moment Western art went from rigid saints in gold backgrounds to dynamic, emotionally rich human figures alive with realism. That's the version we've been sold. But beneath the luminous colors and divine proportions, Renaissance art has a dark, complex underbelly. Behind each awe-inspiring fresco or marble statue was a world riddled with political manipulation, cutthroat patronage, artistic plagiarism, systemic exploitation, and even murder. This was not just a cultural awakening, it was also a ruthless competition between rival families, popes, bankers, and city-states, all using art as propaganda, and artists as pawns in games of control, reputation, and dominance. Renaissance artists were not only inspired dreamers, they were businessmen, schemers, and survivors. Many navigated dangerous allegiances, forged alliances with violent patrons, or stole from predecessors to build their legacies. Some were accused of heresy, others were imprisoned or exiled, and many of the most celebrated works of the era were funded not by pure admiration of beauty, but by wealth extracted through war, colonialism, and the church's sale of salvation. This is the side of Renaissance art that rarely gets told. In the script, we're pulling back the velvet curtain to uncover the shadows behind the masterpieces. From the hidden politics behind the Last Supper to the Medici family's propaganda campaigns, from accusations of necromancy to artists painting torture chambers, we'll explore the Renaissance not as a flawless age of enlightenment, but as a stunning display of light made vivid only by its shadows. To understand how dark Renaissance art could get, we have to start in Florence, the crucible of the Renaissance, and with the most powerful dynasty of the era, the Medici family. While the Medici were known as great patrons of the arts, their motivations were far from purely aesthetic. Art was their political weapon, and Florence was their showroom. The Medici were bankers who rose to power not by birthright, but by financial cunning and manipulation. To cement their control over a republic that technically despised tyranny, they used art to shape public perception. Paintings, sculptures, and architectural projects weren't merely expressions of beauty. They were visual declarations of authority, divine favor, and legitimacy. Cosimo de' Medici commissioned works that emphasized Florence as a new Athens, painting the Medici not just as rulers, but as intellectual saviors of civilization. This strategy escalated under Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, who mastered the art of cultural propaganda. He patronized Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and a young Michelangelo not just to celebrate genius, but to fuse the Medici brand with artistic excellence. The Primavera and Birth of Venus weren't simply mythological scenes. They were allegories casting the Medici as harbingers of harmony and divine rule. Even private chapels like the Medici Chapel were constructed to subtly suggest that the family's power was sanctioned by both classical virtue and Christian piety. But behind the commissions were bloody hands. The Pazzi conspiracy of 1478, an attempted coup against the Medici, resulted in the public lynching of conspirators on the steps of Florence's cathedral. Artists were later commissioned to paint scenes glorifying the Medici's survival and brutal vengeance. Art became public spectacle, reinforcing fear, loyalty, and admiration in one visual blow. In essence, the Medici turned Renaissance aesthetics into a language of political control. The very paintings we marvel at today were once carefully crafted weapons of image warfare. While the Medici weaponized art politically, the Catholic Church turned it into an instrument of divine theater. The Renaissance papacy, particularly in the 15th and 16th centuries, was a spectacle of corruption, and art was both the mask and the megaphone. Popes like Sixtus IV, Julius II, and Leo X transformed Rome into a dazzling capital of artistic achievement, but financed it through morally compromised means. Take the Sistine Chapel ceiling, arguably the most iconic painting in Western history. Commissioned by Pope Julius II, Michelangelo's breathtaking frescoes were painted in the very years the papacy aggressively pushed the sale of indulgences, essentially certificates people could buy to reduce their time in purgatory. These sales funded vast construction projects, including St. Peter's Basilica, and indirectly paid for the glorification of papal power through art. It's a bitter irony, some of the most spiritually transcendent works of art were funded by exploiting spiritual fear. Poor peasants were told they could buy forgiveness. The money went to the Vatican's lavish expansion. Artists, in turn, were hired to elevate the Pope's image to quasi-divine heights. Raphael's School of Athens, for instance, was painted in the papal apartments, portraying ancient philosophers but styled in a way that elevated the Renaissance papacy as the intellectual apex of human history. Even more unsettling is how church commissions sometimes blurred the line between piety and vanity. Tombs for dead cardinals were decorated with heavenly visions that often included their own likenesses among saints and apostles. The message was clear. Salvation could be bought, not just in coin, but in paint and marble. All of this culminated in widespread backlash, most famously from Martin Luther, whose 95 Theses directly attacked the corruption of indulgences. Ironically, the Protestant Reformation that followed cast suspicion on religious imagery altogether, leading to iconoclasm and the destruction of Renaissance art across Northern Europe. The art that once sold salvation was now burned as idolatry. One of the lesser-known aspects of the Renaissance is how rampant artistic plagiarism and theft were among its supposed masters. While we often imagine Renaissance artists as solitary geniuses, the truth is that they operated in a brutally competitive environment where fame, fortune, and survival hinged on staying ahead, and sometimes that meant stealing. Artists routinely studied each other's work, which wasn't unusual, but in many cases, outright copying or borrowing motifs without attribution was standard practice. The line between homage and intellectual theft was blurry, and commissions were frequently awarded based on reputation rather than originality. If one artist developed a successful style, others were quick to imitate it, sometimes before the original was even finished. Giorgione, for instance, was one of the Venetian pioneers of atmospheric painting, but many of his unfinished works were completed, without credit, by Titian, who later became Venice's most celebrated painter. Vasari, in his Lives of the Artists, often obscures the line between collaboration and appropriation, particularly in cases where assistants finished or enhanced the works of more famous masters. Workshop assistants might paint entire sections of a piece, while the master's signature alone adorned the canvas. Even Da Vinci and Michelangelo weren't above accusations of idea theft. Michelangelo was known for studying his rival's sketches, and Da Vinci's notebooks contain not just inventions, but reworkings of classical and contemporary models. In some cases, competition turned nasty. When Leonardo and Michelangelo were both commissioned to paint opposing frescoes in Florence's council hall, the rivalry grew so heated that neither project was completed. The pursuit of artistic immortality during the Renaissance often meant walking the tightrope between inspiration and appropriation. And in a world where reputation equaled survival, it wasn't always the most original who succeeded, but the most politically astute, well-connected, or willing to take credit for someone else's brushwork. We often associate Renaissance art with beauty, grace, and harmony, but one cannot ignore the strange contradiction at the heart of the era. This obsession with beauty coexisted with a celebration of violence. Renaissance art didn't shy away from blood, agony, or domination. In fact, it often turned violence into spectacle, stylizing it to project power and inspire awe. One of the most vivid examples is in martyrdom scenes, which were particularly popular in church commissions. Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows. Saint Bartholomew, skinned alive. These weren't just symbolic tales of devotion, they were anatomical showcases. Artists used the human body in pain as a canvas to display their technical prowess. Muscles, tendons, and contorted expressions were painted in exquisite detail, their suffering transformed into visual art. In the process, torture became both spiritual and aesthetic. This went beyond martyrdom. Public executions, decapitations, and battles were depicted with grand, almost theatrical flair. Consider Donatello's Judith and Holofernes, a bronze statue in which Judith calmly beheads the Assyrian general, or Titian's Flaying of Marsyas, where the satyr is literally being skinned alive, painted with rich, dynamic brushwork that makes the horror almost seductive. Why did this happen? In part because Renaissance patrons, especially rulers, understood that art could communicate fear just as well as virtue. A prince commissioning an image of St. George slaying a dragon wasn't just promoting Christian legend, he was issuing a subtle threat to enemies and rivals. This is what happens to opposition. Blood was a message. This is perhaps best seen in the political iconography of Florence and Rome. Statues of Hercules, for example, were placed in civic squares not only to glorify strength and virtue, but to remind the population who held the real power. Hercules crushing enemies beneath his feet was a metaphor for Florentine dominance. Even the idealized human forms of Michelangelo's David or the Sistine Chapel's nude figures were, in many ways, tied to violence. They reflect a culture obsessed with the body, its perfection, its vulnerability, and its potential for suffering. Renaissance art wasn't just about celebrating humanity. It was about mastering and displaying it, even at its most brutal. The Renaissance was a time of rediscovered classical wisdom, but it also flirted constantly with forbidden knowledge. As artists studied ancient texts, experimented with geometry and anatomy, and embraced human reason, the church watched with growing suspicion. Some of the most celebrated Renaissance artists were accused of heresy, alchemy, or occult practices, not always without cause. Take Leonardo da Vinci. Though now seen as the quintessential Renaissance genius, in his own time, his interest in dissecting human corpses, drawing flying machines, and coding notebooks in mirror writing struck many as unsettling. He was a scientist, yes, but also a man of secrets. His famous Vitruvian Man wasn't just a study of proportion, it was a diagram loaded with philosophical, almost mystical symbolism. Some have even speculated connections to Kabbalah or Pythagorean numerology. Artists who strayed too far into the esoteric risked real danger. The church had mechanisms for dealing with those it saw as heretical. Filippino Lippi painted demons and bizarre dreamscapes that raised clerical eyebrows. The painter Giulio Romano created erotic frescoes for the Palazzo del Te in Mantua that bordered on blasphemy. Artists who worked for forbidden patrons or painted pagan myths too liberally sometimes faced excommunication, exile, or worse. Even the architecture of the time wasn't safe. Bramante and Michelangelo incorporated classical pagan symbols into their church designs, sparking debates about hidden messages and theological boundaries. In Rome, whispers spread that some artists were channeling ancient gods under the guise of Christian saints. In Northern Europe, the line between art and witchcraft was even thinner. In the wake of the Reformation and ensuing witch hunts, artists like Hans Belden Green began portraying witches in terrifying, eroticized forms. These weren't cautionary warnings. They were visual obsessions. The female body, magic, and the occult merged into dark iconography that spoke to deeper cultural fears about disorder, sexuality, and rebellion. Whether or not Renaissance artists were actual heretics, many walked a fine line, exploring knowledge, power, and symbolism in ways that challenged the orthodoxy of their time. Their masterpieces often contained layered meanings, some divine, some arcane, all dangerous in a world ruled by suspicion and fear. Perhaps the most insidious darkness of Renaissance art lies not in what was shown, but in what was deliberately left out. For all its grandeur, the Renaissance was built on foundations of inequality, slavery, colonial wealth, gender subjugation, and the erasure of non-European peoples. Art was complicit in this selective memory, painting a vision of humanity that was idealized, exclusive, and highly curated. People of African descent appear in Renaissance art, but almost always as background figures, pages, servants, or symbolic exotics. In Venice, Genoa, and Lisbon, major trade ports deeply involved in the slave trade, black subjects were present in daily life, yet almost entirely absent from the artistic spotlight. When they were depicted, they were stripped of individuality, cast as foils to white saints, kings, or nobles. And yet, many Renaissance courts and households relied on enslaved individuals. Portugal and Spain were importing slaves from Africa by the 15th century, and Italian city-states weren't far behind. This wealth funded churches, palaces, and art commissions. But the faces of the enslaved rarely made it into the canvas. Women, too, were filtered through a narrow lens. Female beauty was idealized, but the real experiences of Renaissance women, illiteracy, forced marriages, limited legal rights, were rarely acknowledged. Female patrons like Isabella d'Este or Sofonisba Anguissola were exceptions in a male-dominated system. Women artists existed, but their works were often attributed to men or forgotten entirely. This selective portrayal created a false canon, one that celebrated a narrow, Eurocentric, patriarchal vision of greatness. It shaped centuries of cultural memory, reinforcing the idea that genius, power, and beauty looked a certain way. The Renaissance didn't just reflect inequality, it reinforced it, visually encoding a social hierarchy that would persist long after the brushstrokes dried. Only recently have art historians begun recovering the stories and faces erased from Renaissance art, re-examining works for hidden meanings, uncredited contributors, or marginalized figures lost in the corners of canvas. These silences speak volumes, reminding us that even the most luminous art can cast long shadows. We often speak of Renaissance artists as titans of genius, but behind their brilliance was a cost rarely discussed. Many of these men lived under intense pressure, political scrutiny, and personal torment. Art was not always catharsis, it was compulsion. And for some, the price of greatness was psychological unraveling. Take Michelangelo, a master of sculpture, architecture, and painting. He was also a man consumed by religious anxiety, self-doubt, and solitude. He rarely bathed, distrusted most of his patrons, and kept himself in virtual isolation for months while painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, often working lying on his back for hours at a time in physical agony. His letters reveal a man tortured by perfectionism and racked with guilt, constantly questioning whether his work was truly in service of God or his own vanity. Leonardo da Vinci, for all his intellectual brilliance, was infamous for not finishing projects. He left dozens of paintings incomplete and spent years obsessively revising works like the Virgin of the Rocks. He was restless, easily distracted, and often dissatisfied with his own output. Behind the calm, enigmatic smile of the Mona Lisa is an artist who may have struggled with chronic procrastination and identity anxiety, possibly even queerness in a deeply homophobic society. Caravaggio, though born just after the Renaissance's peak, perfectly embodied its violent aftermath. A painter of shocking realism and radical lighting, Caravaggio brought an emotional brutality to his work that mirrored his personal life. He brawled in taverns, killed a man in a duel, and fled Rome under threat of execution. His subjects, often drawn from the streets, sex workers, or marginalized men, reflected a chaotic and tormented soul who turned violence and beauty into something indistinguishable. Artistic genius in the Renaissance came with immense pressure to please wealthy, often tyrannical patrons, to navigate political intrigue, and to wrestle with the existential weight of creating immortal work. For many, the workshop was not just a place of creation, it was a battleground of the mind. While we often romanticize Renaissance art as a flourishing of freedom, the reality was more tightly controlled than it appears. Artists operated under a complex web of censorship, both formal and informal, enforced by the church, state, and powerful patrons. If a painting crossed the line, be it theological, sexual, or political, it could mean more than a ruined career. It could mean imprisonment, excommunication, or death. The Church, particularly during the Counter-Reformation, became increasingly aggressive in monitoring artistic expression. After the Council of Trent in 1563, religious imagery was strictly regulated. Nudity, once celebrated as a symbol of divine beauty, came under suspicion. Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, with its muscular, naked saints and damned sinners, was deemed so scandalous that shortly after his death, a hired artist was brought in to paint loincloths over the exposed figures. The man earned the nickname Il Braghettone, the breeches maker. Political control was just as tight. In Florence, Cosimo I de' Medici tightly curated the city's visual narrative. Only works that glorified his rule or reflected classical virtues were welcomed. In Venice, the Doge and the Inquisition worked hand in hand to monitor artists for any hint of subversion. And in Spain, the Inquisition didn't just target books, it banned paintings deemed heretical, burning or mutilating works that hinted at unapproved theology. Even private patrons enforced their own form of censorship. Artists had to flatter, obey, and sometimes glorify people they despised. If a patron demanded their face appear in the guise of St. Peter or the Virgin Mary, the artist had little choice. Refusing could mean loss of livelihood, or worse, permanent blacklisting. This culture of control didn't just limit what was created, it shaped how we remember the Renaissance. The works that survived were the ones that conformed, the controversial, the radical, the provocative. Many were destroyed, censored, or never commissioned at all. The very canon we now celebrate is, in part, the product of centuries of gatekeeping. So what, in the end, did the Renaissance leave us? The standard answer: beauty, humanism, genius. But the fuller answer is more conflicted. The Renaissance gave us Michelangelo, but also censorship. It gave us Da Vinci, but also indulgences. It birthed the celebration of man's intellect and form, while erasing entire populations, cultures, and identities from its portraits of greatness. The Renaissance set the stage for modernity, yes, but it also codified who belonged in that vision of modernity and who did not. Its elevation of universal beauty came at the expense of non-European, non-male, and non-Christian subjects. Its genius thrived because others were silenced, and its ideals, reason, symmetry, virtue, were often tools for control, wrapped in gold leaf. The irony is that Renaissance art, for all its light, was deeply enmeshed in shadow. And perhaps that's the real legacy, not a lie, but a half-truth. An age of brilliance that also trafficked in fear, exclusion, and illusion. A time when the brush elevated both the soul and the state, sanctified both the sublime and the violent. Yet within those contradictions lies its enduring power. The fact that Renaissance art still captivates us, centuries later, suggests that its complexity is what makes it human. And in that tension between divine ideal and earthly failure, between truth and propaganda, we find a mirror, not just of the Renaissance, but of ourselves.